media conference. And my name is Dukni. I work with Native Movement as a community organizer. And I go by she, her, and I'm on the lower Tanana Dene lands. So we'll have this time to hear from Alyssa, Rebecca, Kinsley, and Margie about false solutions. And so if everybody would be able to either in the chat or you could unmute yourself, just introduce yourself, who you work for, pronouns, and what lands you're on. But welcome to this conversation.
Maybe we can start with those of us planning to talk today. I'm Rebecca Noblin. I am Policy Justice Lead at Native Movement. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm on Dena'ina lands and Guyakuk or Anchorage. And I'll pass off to Elisa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elisa Sappenfield, and I use she, they pronouns. I'm also on Dena'ina lands in Anchorage, and I'm an energy analyst with the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, or FCAC, and the Alaska Public Interest Research Group, or ACPIRG. I'll pop it over to Margie.
Hey, everyone. My name is Margie, she, her pronouns on Dena'ina land. I'm the Regenerative Economies Director for the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, and grateful to be here. I'll pass to Kinsley.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces and nice to meet everyone who I haven't already met. I'm Kinsley. My pronouns are she, her. I'm calling in from Lower Tanana Dene lands, and I am the Energy Justice Organizer for Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition.
Awesome, thanks for sharing. And if everyone else could write in the chat, name, pronouns, where lands you're on, and who you work for. And I'll also be sharing our agreements for this time, just so that we could make sure that we have this space. So we just want to make sure that we're listening for understanding, just being mindful. We aren't here to solve everything. And unlearning is as important as learning. And also an ouch, oops. So like, make sure just to be aware of other people and in this conversation. And whatever stories are shared here, just they'll stay here. And I forgot what wait in Elmo means, but
Why am I talking? Why aren't I talking is wait. So if you're somebody who talks a lot, maybe step back. If you're somebody who doesn't talk very often, maybe think about trying to get a comment in. And then Elmo is enough, let's move on.
Yeah, so these are the agreements we have for today as we have this conversation about false solutions.
Thanks to me. Should we get started?
Yeah, we could get started. So I have so what is a false solution? What do we mean when we talk about false solutions?
Yeah, and just so everyone knows, this is a community conversation, and those of us who are sort of panelists will be having a conversation with each other. We also invite you all to join the conversation. If you have your own questions or comments or thoughts, please join in. We'll also leave time at the end for more conversation, but feel free to jump in at any time. And Tugni's just going to be asking us a few questions about false solutions that we'll be thinking about answers to. And you know, nothing is black or white in these sorts of conversations. So we're not here to say like exactly what, you know, this is a false solution and this isn't, but we're here to sort of all think a little bit about what goes into a real solution and what goes into a false solution and what might be behind our words when we say false solutions. So I think of a false solution as a solution that, like a solution to climate change that might reduce greenhouse gas emissions or might temporarily look like it's going to help, but that doesn't do anything to change the systems that have gotten us to this place in the first place. For example, sort of top-down solutions, corporate solutions, are often false solutions. What do other folks think?
Yeah, I'll jump in here a little bit. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of dialogue and discussion about ways to sort of solve climate problems and which is the best path to take. And we hear a lot about maybe technological fixes or market schemes that are often promoted by industry and their political allies that kind of give an appearance of meaningful climate action when actually they don't really address what we talk about as like root causes, what Rebecca was kind of talking about in the beginning, things that got us here in the first place. And so that we don't kind of have a deja vu moment years down the line, we don't repeat those same mistakes. And so we really want to be building something transformative instead of false.
I'll jump in, bouncing off of that, Elisa. I think what often comes to my mind is that false solutions are not only about the technologies or the like the upgrades of energy sources or climate solutions, but it's also about the process of how those are developed and who has say in that, who is getting power from that. Is it the industry or is it the people? Or is it the people living on those lands in those communities who have asked for this solution and who believe that it's in their best interest as stewards of that land? And I think that, yeah, like making sure that that process is part of the conversation is just as important as the technology itself when considering any solution for the climate crisis. There's also a metaphor. It's not mine to share, but I don't know if anybody else wanted to share that because I do love the bucket metaphor.
I think Glow put a link in the chat to what are false solutions and how do we identify them, which has the metaphor, which is you have a water, a faucet, water's overflowing, it's rushing out. What do? Do you get a bucket, but the bucket's going to overflow? Do you get a lot of buckets? They're all eventually going to overflow. Do you dump the bucket somewhere else? Well, that's still too much water. The real solution is to turn off the faucet. And so when we're looking at real solutions, they have to actually address the root problem. And thank you, Glow, for that metaphor. Do other folks on the call have thoughts about what false solutions mean to them?
Yeah, I'd love to open it up and hear from folks who are attending. Oh,
I was gonna say, I agree with everything that you all said, especially about, continuing business as usual with these extractive systems, that are not community based. And I think of false solutions also as like giving those same companies money to continue to poison our earth, just in a different way. So a lot of like some of the new energy stuff coming out now that's being put forward by these oil and gas companies, I would consider to be false solutions because of that.
Yeah, Alexis.
I guess what I'm thinking about when I'm hearing everyone talk is a little bit more about how we get to false solutions. It seems like we get to false solutions without having conversations. We just have situations where someone comes in, maybe it's a corporation or even, a scientific company, and saying this is the solution, and there's not really a discussion. It's more like, do we adopt this solution or do we not, and are we for the environment or are we not? There's a lot of like that kind of this or that dichotomy versus really looking at what is sustainable, what is, and even ask ourselves the question of how do we decide what's good for the environment? How do we decide what's good for us? I just think that more conversations like this, if it could happen on even larger scales, would be great, because it seems like we get those false solutions because then everybody gets on or off a bandwagon, versus having the conversations that really get to what is actually a solution. Anyway, sorry if I'm kind of rambling. That's just what I'm thinking about.
That's great. Thanks for sharing, everybody. The next question I have for the panelists, what are examples of things that have been called false solutions, and what makes these false solutions?
So I can start. I work for Native Movement, and one of the climate solutions that we consider to be a false solution is nuclear energy. And, I think especially large nuclear energy, any nuclear energy, but there's the sort of like top-down corporate piece of it. And then there's also nuclear energy is environmentally destructive, even if it goes well. So the mining of uranium produces quite a bit of pollution, and it has historically been primarily on indigenous lands in the US. So even setting aside like safety concerns down the line, there's no way to mine uranium in a way that doesn't have harmful impacts on the communities around it. And there's no way to enrich uranium without having harmful impacts on the people. The uranium enrichment plants are typically located in BIPOC communities. And so nuclear energy, though it would, create less greenhouse gases than burning oil, we consider a false solution because of all the harmful effects.
yeah, and I would also kind of build on that with some of what we were talking about in terms of like techno fixes before, and kind of jumping on the bandwagon. What Alexis was saying earlier is that a lot of these things become really large, costly infrastructure projects. And with nuclear, at least what we've seen of nuclear in the past couple decades, is that it's incredibly expensive, and those construction timelines are incredibly long. And for a lot of the issues we're facing around climate today, those timelines just don't match, and those costs can be used and put forward in different technologies that are significantly cheaper and more abundant, especially in Alaska, like wind and solar.
Hi, this is Lisa. Hi, good to see you all. Sorry, my camera's off. My bandwidth is crappy. But yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up nuclear and especially micronuclear, because that is something that I think a lot of people are pushing for pretty seriously right now. And it's not yet proven. And I think, and again, I think that one of the elements I've not seen spoken of in the discussions about how great micronuclear would be, particularly in communities across Alaska, remote communities, is the discussion of the uranium mining and then the waste storage. I've just seen, well, you know, you just bring in, it's safer than the big cooling towers, and you just bring in this, you know, and I'm sorry, the word is escaping me, but the reactor element of it, but you bring that in, it lasts 10 plus years, maybe 20 years, and then you fly it away, you know, it gets shipped away back to the lower 48. And I think that it's really critical that the full life cycle is addressed. And another one, and I'm sure others will bring this up, that I think is a growing issue. It's been on the radar in Fairbanks, at least for over 50 years, is natural gas. And that's a serious false solution that I think a lot are turning towards right now on a lot of different levels, from government down to utilities. And I'm on the Climate Action Committee with the Borough Assembly in Fairbanks. And we actually were discussing one element of the plan yesterday, and natural gas was written in that, and that came up as an issue with the borough mayor and others as we were discussing, like, well, if you're going to include this, as you know, you need to qualify what that really means, you know, because it really isn't a climate solution. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you. And then also Bridget in the comment said, like, on a smaller scale, I can't help but think about Biden's executive actions that came out today. For example, distributing efficient air conditioning units rather than meaningfully addressing the climate emergency.
Yeah, and Bridget, to that point, I think that the scale of how effective a solution will be is definitely part of the conversation. And I think a big part that the community where that solution could be implemented would have real insight and expertise into. So thanks for sharing that, Bridget. And Lisa, great segue into natural gas.
Yeah, I can start talking about that, but I did want to mention one other thing about there was a mention about micronuclear and the legislation. I think Rebecca had noted in the chat that had passed this last legislative session in Alaska. And, you know, Lisa talked about it too, is just the level of proven scientific study on these things. And kind of there's an assumption with micronuclear that because of the smaller scale, there would be proportionately smaller or less waste. But there's actually studies to show that isn't true, and that in fact they might produce more waste per unit of energy that they can generate. But I'll stop there for nuclear. Patricia, did you want to say something about nuclear before I move on to LNG, or is it would you like to say something different?
Yeah, no, I like to bring up whenever people bring up ideas and really, so the legislature and others are seriously considering micronuclear, nuclear, etc. And if they're seriously going to consider it, I tend to bring up the out of the box thinking and bombastic ideas, but I think it's actually pretty bombastic to go in the direction of nuclear. So if they're going to do that, the discussions about what to do with the waste and what to do with the tailings from mining uranium. I think they really need to talk about, well, we're going to gather it all up. I mean, your ultimate solution has to be to remove it from the earth. So how are you going to remove it from the earth? And if we're getting into a world that's technologically savvy and how would you say? I mean, in Fairbanks, we don't see it, but in a lot of other places, we see a lot of technology being used as part of life. But as bizarre as it sounds, I'm going to say this. I think that if any kind of pursuit of nuclear happens in the very polite political climate of trying to find solutions, they're going to have to find a way to get it off this planet. And that, I guess that's all I want to say about that is it can't just be moved to China. It can't be moved to a developing country that needs income and is going to use the waste from nuclear to be a source of income from them. It can't be used at all on the earth. It needs to be removed. So what's their plan to remove it and to get them to think in that direction? Because if people like Elon Musk and others are sending private individuals into space, it seems to me that we need to start asking them to do some really crazy things to get nuclear waste off the planet and not just hand it to some poor country so they can make a few pennies to survive.
Thanks, Patricia. Yeah, and of course, the waste on the back end is just part of the problem. We've got the front end pollution problem as well. Elisa, did you want to talk about natural gas?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure folks have seen that in the headlines or maybe thinking about it most recently because of some news regarding gas supply into Cook Inlet and how that basically helps heat the rail belt region and provide electricity to the rail belt region. But you know, the natural gas pipeline project has been around for decades in Alaska. It's 40 plus years old, and so there's been different iterations of this. And all prior iterations failed for the same reasons why I think this current one is controversial. And that has a lot to do with whether or not there is a market for it, an appetite for it beyond the Cook Inlet, and what natural gas does to our environment, and also the cost of the project. And so essentially natural gas is mostly methane. It's about 70% methane, and in ambient temperatures, it's in a gas form, but it can be which can be transported like oil, like through a pipeline over long distances. But it's more easily transported when it's cooled at extremely low temperatures. And that liquefaction process is pretty costly. Overall, the current Alaska natural gas pipeline plan is close to $40 billion in cost. And this is supposed to run fairly parallel to where the current TAPS pipeline runs, and then it kind of veers off through the Denali Borough, the Mat-Su Borough, and then to Nikiski for a eventually so that it can be sent across the ocean to presumably Asian markets. And so the problem, I think, largely is, again, that large $40 billion figure and the timeline, too, again, of when that would actually be possible. I think that a lot of the estimates usually are around the 2030, late 2020 kind of estimates. But those are very optimistic estimates, given the fact that these projects have failed before. And then that cost really locks you in. The other big problem with this project is it really locks you in to infrastructure that has a lifetime of decades, when we have a climate situation and an energy need in a matter of years. And so that really makes it really problematic. And moreover, natural gas and methane have issues. There's not good reporting on the level of emissions for natural gas, but the level of leakage is estimated to be underreported. And it's also understood that natural gas is more destructive to the environment. So while gas has lower CO2 emissions than something like coal or oil when burned for electricity, it has a short lifespan. It's about 28 times greater in terms of destructiveness to the environment than CO2 when calculated over a century. And so some factors about why natural gas might be the solution, a common thread, is sort of this large locked-in investment, and again, the timing and the science.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'll jump in before opening it up, because I know a lot of you on screen today probably have lots of expertise about natural gas, but I would just add that in thinking about false solutions or real solutions, the underlying idea and principle here is a just transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. And natural gas is a fossil fuel. So switching from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel is not the long-term solution that we need. And I think all of that science and economics that Elisa was talking about just backs that up. But, you know, essentially natural gas, whether it's in a gas form or a liquid form, it is still a fossil fuel. And if that is to be used as the bridge, that does not mean new investment in new infrastructure, because just like Lisa said, that would lock us into fossil fuel dependency for decades to come. It's not something that could just be done for like a couple of years if you're developing and spending money for all of that infrastructure. But I'll stop there, don't need to repeat anything. And yeah, Alexis, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I also, this discussion is also making me think about electric vehicles, something I'm a little concerned about as well, of that being a false solution, because, the way we get electricity is different depending on each state. In Alaska, it's, I think, the largest percent of our source of electricity is natural gas. And then, we're doing pretty well, I think, overall with renewable sources, but, the need for electricity, as that grows, the need for that, the source of electricity grows. And so that's something to really think about. I really wish that, I don't understand, obviously, I'm not a business person, but I don't understand a business model that is using limited resources. One thing that I always like to kind of push with people that think that, gas is the way to go, or natural gas, petroleum, anything, those are all finite resources. They will run out. They aren't infinite. And so if we don't start now setting up infrastructure and things that work around sources that are like moving water or wind or sun, things that are available to us right now and for the foreseeable future for us, then we're just going to, no matter what, we're going to run into a situation where we don't have that any longer. Natural gas isn't infinite, petroleum isn't infinite. So just thinking about those things as well, kind of that long-term sustainability, even not just short-term. Sorry, I think I kind of went off on a tangent.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And just like kind of following on that sort of like long-term sustainability, the bridge narrative is super misleading. It really sets up this idea that it's a bridge somewhere, that's somewhere that's maybe far off. And I think a lot of that was based on thinking that renewable technology was maybe immature or too expensive. But that kind of discussion doesn't really apply to the present day. As I said before, wind and solar energy are increasingly less expensive and abundant. And so the bridge fuel narrative is, I don't think, applicable. I'm not sure if it really was, but it certainly is not today.
Definitely heard a lot about natural gas being used to make hydrogen lately. And so it's helpful for me to segue to that. I can, talking about green hydrogen, carbon intensity. And in terms of that bridge fuel idea. But anything else to add before we do that?
No, I was just about to ask if you guys wanted to add on to anything else before going to the next question.
Cool. So I'll be brief here, but green hydrogen is produced with renewable energy sources, not fossil fuels, and anything else is produced with fossil fuels. And so just being really clear about the potential misleading rhetoric around what is clean energy there in a hydrogen fuel context. I think it is really exciting to think about powering our shipping industry and even aviation industry with hydrogen fuels. It can be a great way to harness some of the spillover renewable energy that's being generated that exceeds the demand by the grid, whether that's a really small microgrid or the rail belt. And so just thinking about that, I know in Southeast, hydro that is fish friendly can produce a lot of this near places that are shipping hubs as well in the Aleutians. So thinking about that as a way to store and transport energy, but really wanting to be clear that it's not clean if it involves fossil fuels. And then there's also the question of like carbon capture and storage. And it's a little bit of a long time ago, but we did this webinar, Ruth and I, and we also had a really sweet conversation that we did with Ine. So I'm just going to drop the link to this one pager in the chat with resources about carbon markets and the links to the recordings of those previous conversations, and to say that a lot of times the idea of net zero is held up as a solution. And a lot of times, if you really get into the details of how that carbon calculating is done and accounting, there's a lot more on the spreadsheet than is actually happening in terms of real world atmospheric greenhouse gas levels. And so that's why we're really interested in preventing emissions from going into the atmosphere, and don't trust that even if we inject them into the ground in terms of carbon capture and storage, that they will stay there where you inject them. So similarly, all sorts of questions to be really grappled with in terms of the impacts of even like carbon credits and planting trees on indigenous lands, especially in the global south. So really centering the stopping the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, and indigenous sovereignty over land stewardship in terms of carbon management. One of the best things we can do to fight climate change is to support land back. So I'll stop there. And I guess actually I did have one other thing I wanted to share before I stop talking. And that is, we have a soft launch of a podcast that feels really pertinent to today's conversation. And this is a dialogue about the Just Transition Summit and the, I call it the Governor's Fall Solution Summit. And it's technically called the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, but that title I think is a little bit of a misnomer and greenwashing, if I'm speaking frankly in this friendly audience. So I shared a little blurb about that, and you can find that on our website, fairbanksclimateaction.org. Thanks.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for sharing, everybody. So the last question I have for the panelists is, how do we identify real solutions? So we've talked about all these false solutions. Now, what are some things that could be real?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we kind of maybe in our wisdom already kind of started talking about it, kind of organically as a group today. And I think that's really neat. But we had kind of talked about the idea of root causes. And so the root causes of climate change, they're multifaceted and intersectional. And a lot of the ways that we approach the problems with, climate have to do with it oriented in a kind of a climate justice framework. And that really emerges from a lot of global grassroots movements that have relationships with labor and struggles with, rooted in Indigenous, Black, and people of color communities, migrant communities, and thanks to the leadership of women and gender non-binary folks in terms of movement making. And so basically there have been some generally agreed upon kind of pathways or principles through these movements to really ensure that real solutions are tailored to tackle those root systemic drivers. And a lot of that has to do with sort of core values, like the principle of nothing about us without us is something that you may have heard. And we'll share a little bit more today of some of those principles that we've taken and through our organizations. I think Rebecca will, to sort of give you guys a list to start asking those questions and realizing that there's not always a perfect right answer, but it is sort of a list to start that discussion. And so Rebecca, I don't know if you want to introduce more.
Do we want to sort of go through the hoodwinked
Oh yeah, that's right.
list?
I kind of skipped ahead there first. And so I guess our list is more specific to Alaska, or our Alaska work and some of the thinking that we've undergone. But for folks, if you want a smaller list to kind of start out thinking about what real solutions look like, we really appreciate our allies with the Indigenous Environmental Network and their zine, The Hoodwinked in the Hot House. So you'll see in that zine, they have a really nice succinct list kind of near the end about what real solutions to climate change must do. And so I'll just go through, it's a series of six things. The first one is to be guided by principled practice. The second, be guided by Indigenous traditional knowledge, place-based experience, and public interest science. Third, be holistic in tackling all intertwined ecological and social harm. 4, replace economies of greed with economies of serving ecological and human need. 5, and this is something we really talked about in terms of conversation, advancing deep, direct, and participatory democracy rooted in local self-determination. And then 6, centering the leadership and the needs of those presently and historically most harmed, at the forefront, being kind of a general list of some attributes towards that, a better climate justice framework.
Yeah, and as Elisa was mentioning, toward that sort of first point, be guided by principled practice. We've been working on trying to come up with some questions to ask, sort of Alaska specific questions to ask when looking at policies that will help guide us to make decisions about whether policies promote a just transition, and whether the sort of solutions being promoted in particular policies are real solutions or whether we would consider them to be false solutions. And the list of questions, so the dream is to come up with a scorecard that folks can use to sort of rate policy and put it on a scale of like horrendous to the dream. We don't have like an interactive scorecard yet. We just at this point have a list of questions that will help folks consider when you're looking at policies where they land. And Brittany or screen share that, the Just Transition Policy Scorecard. So what we've done is based on the work of a lot of other organizations who have sort of put together different lists of questions to ask, and based on the Thrive zine, which maybe somebody could link in the chat, which lists out pillars of for just transition. We've come up with, I think we have, how many categories do we have? A handful of categories, and some questions under those categories to consider. So for example, if you're looking at a policy like promoting nuclear energy, maybe you would ask some of these questions. One of the questions, I'm going to look under climate and energy and say, does it abide by the principle of do no harm to our bodies, waters, land, and climate? Well, nuclear energy, no, it doesn't abide by that principle because the practice of uranium mining is very harmful. So at this point, there's not sort of like a number score to give, but these are questions to help us all sort of think about and have conversations with each other and have conversations with policymakers about like what are the elements that we want in a policy to make it a real solution to climate change that we can support. Is there anything you want to add to that, Elisa?
Yeah, I would say that you may answer differently than other people, or everybody might have the same answer. The point of this is to ask the question. And I think that's really helpful. You know, and you might say yes or no to something that feels bad, but you know, for your local community, you can understand things through this scorecard that is more particularized. And so again, it really is not to say that something is absolutely a false solution, but it is to have a dialogue about it so that we can better understand those root causes, and then share with the people around us in the conversation.
I'll also add this as a work in progress. So if you go to that link and see something that you think should, a question that we should be asking, please let us know. I'll put my email address in the chat.
Does anybody else have anything else to add to the question of what are some examples of real solutions?
I wasn't going to add, but since you asked, I think that actually the regenerative economic visions that a bunch of folks have around the state are really exciting. And so Glow, if you could link another zine, we've got this guide to Alaska's regenerative economies that kind of goes by sector of the economy and points to real-time things that people are doing around the state. And it's not some distant future, it's happening now. And I feel like that really helps counteract the dominant narrative around fossil fuels being our past, present, and future as Alaska, and really helps at least me feel like I have a firm foothold in building towards a fossil-free future.
I don't know if this is the part where I guess we're starting to drop resources, but in relation to LNG, it's not so much a resource, but an opportunity. There is a public comment period with the Department of Energy that ends, I believe, August 10th or 15th, I think maybe the 15th. And you can find information about that in the link below and comment that way. And then if folks are thinking about electricity and the rail belt grid and want to be more involved with the future planning of the grid and thinking about the integration of renewables. What do we do about cook and lit gas? I would offer that you look into the Rail Belt Reliability Council, which is an organization I'm part of that is working on rail belt issues. And we're currently in the process of getting approved by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska to be that oversight entity for the rail belt, and are looking for folks to attend our meetings, provide public comment. And then once we get to the point of developing integrated resource plan or developing reliability standards for the rail belt, that you participate as a member of a working group, because we really need everyday Alaskans to be, represented in those areas where oftentimes we have a lot of industry or utility level capacity and resources that kind of overwhelm those voices. And so check out the link below. It has our past board meeting minutes and our future meetings.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the things we've been talking about? Or do you have any more resources to share?
I'll share one more thing. And I guess overall, I share this to maybe demonstrate the nuance of some of these things that we're pushing for and how complicated that can be in real life. So very long story short, the Golden Valley Electric Association recently voted by their board of directors to adopt a strategic generation plan. And that plan includes 5 points. And I'm not going to go into detail because I could talk forever about this. But some of those points are steps forward and wins along our path, successes along our path to a just transition. And some of those points seem like steps backward or steps sideways, or not really addressing the root problem of extraction from fossil fuels. For example, one of those points is that Golden Valley has committed to develop a plan to close the Healy Unit 2 coal plant, which is great when you think of the stopping the extraction, stopping the bad, ending reliance on coal. And the nuance of that is that this plan that they come up with really has to include a job transition plan for the community members in Healy, and should be developed and implemented in a justice-focused way and in a transparent way. So I just share that as, again, like the nuance and pushing for some of these things and commenting on some of these things can be done in a participatory way, because Golden Valley is an electric cooperative, meaning that member owners who pay bills have a voice in that. And that is, in practice, in theory, in a perfect world. And the implementation of that, there are still challenges that organizations like FCAC up in the interior and other organizations and individuals all the way along the rail belt through Homer are focused on these issues with electric co-ops. So yeah, that is one way, in addition to what Elisa said about getting involved with the RCA, getting involved at the local scale with your electric co-op is another great step. And I'll stop talking there, but happy to connect individually if anyone is interested.
We are getting close to end of the hour. Is there anybody that had any comments or questions that you wanted to share?
I did see something in the chat about geothermal that I thought was really interesting. And I'm not sure if that person's still here. Oh. Oh yeah. Kate, I think you had been talking about repurposing old infrastructure to using geothermal or kind of harnessing geothermal energy. And I think like I'm not entirely certain about geothermal science and stuff like that. I'd love to look at the link that you had sent, but I do think that we will have in the near future an issue with old infrastructure from this old ways of generation, and that we should be thinking about how we dismantle and remove and remediate that infrastructure is really important and will be really costly. And so ways that we address that sooner rather than later are critical.
And there's a lot of jobs that can be generated in addressing some of those cleanups and capping of old wells and dismantling of the pipeline. So just sharing that sense of like possibility too, that it's not doom and gloom. It's actually, yeah, a revenue generating source of employment too. Yeah, to Kensley's comment in the chat, we have a report on the website aknexteconomy.com about Alaska's renewable energy future potentials, and some numbers in there to share include there will be more jobs in the renewable energy sector than currently employed in the fossil fuel industry in Alaska. As soon as 2030, like we can be fully powered by renewables in the state. So that's another positive thing to share.
Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing and taking this time out for today. I really appreciate the conversations that we had in the last hour.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the conversations, and this was recorded so we can share that if anyone wants to rewatch, and can send out resources as well.
Thanks, guys.